Okay. Zoom people, you should hear now. All right. Wow. There's a lot of you. My name is Evan. My name is Evan Ross. I am the founder and the CEO, I suppose, of StorySeer. It's a strategic narrative consultancy. We'll talk a little bit about that. I'm going to be your host for today. So, yeah, just going to start off with an expression of gratitude to see so many of you here today. This is the first talk I've ever given, and I thought I would be a lot more terrified, but heart's kind of beating, but I think that that'll be some good energy to get us through this. So thank you all so much for coming today. I think we got a good show today. We're gonna kind of go for a little bit of a journey. So buckle up and let's get to the subject. There we go. All right. We all know story is powerful. Some of us might even know how these Silicon Valley legends use it to scale. And so you might be wondering, how can I do the same for my company? Because you know that story isn't just this shiny foil you wrap around your product to make it sell. Story is everything, which is why Ben Horowitz said story is the strategy, and that a compelling story is what sets your company in motion. It's how Elon Musk, Marc Benioff, Steve Jobs, Brian Halligan, the CEOs of Gainsight and Zuora, discovered a powerful insight about their markets and then communicated it using a 5-act story structure, which allowed them to inspire behavior change in prospects, customers, investors, employees, and others to create this compounding movement that launched them into hypergrowth. So we know story is important, but practically speaking, how do we actually use it? Do we use it to structure our pitch decks when we're raising capital? Do we use it to attract talent, onboard employees, and inspire them during our quarterly all hands? Does it act as a North Star guiding product and customer success? Or does it align sales and marketing behind the same powerful message? The answer to all of these is yes, which is why today I'm going to teach you about strategic narrative, how one story can help you raise capital, close deals, and ignite market-defining movements. When I first started my journey into understanding this powerful technique some 7 years ago, I was tremendously inspired to learn that storytelling is actually a big deal in business. I'd had dreams since I was very little of making a career out of story, and I thought I'd failed after I dropped the ball on a few attempts at narrative design in video games towards the end of college. I graduated with no dream job lined up and had to take a job at a marketing agency / tech startup doing demand gen. I felt so much like a failure that I went full workaholic, which got the attention of the owners, who then tasked me with building the marketing function for their SaaS platform. Now, I had no clue what I was doing, but I read a ton of books on positioning and messaging and crossing the chasm and all that good stuff. But the thing that really kickstarted this journey was when I read an article going viral on Medium at the time called The Greatest Sales Deck I Have Ever Seen. It was by a guy named Andy Raskin, who talks about strategic narrative, which he defines as one story that powers success in sales, marketing, fundraising, recruiting, and more. His work centers on the use of a simple but powerful story structure that anyone can learn regardless of background. As a creative writer myself, I was super inspired, so I decided that I was going to master strategic narrative. Little did I know that this decision would set off a crazy sequence of events that would take me from automotive to fintech to consulting and then to edtech before finally founding StorySeer, a strategic narrative consultancy that helps visionary leaders create radical behavior change at scale. This professional story arc mirrored an intellectual one, a personal one, and even a spiritual one that required me to confront some scary stuff. Because I came to learn that telling those legendary unicorn narratives is about way more than just using some 5-act story structure. it requires us to go deep. And working in climate, it requires us to go beyond CO2 emissions and biodiversity loss in order to grapple with the behavioral, technological, and systemic dynamics that create them, as well as existential risks for our startups. And so to elucidate how we can use story to ignite those market-defining movements, I'm going to first define the problem by taking us down the rabbit hole I went through to understand something I call the crisis of coherence. If any of you have heard the term meta-crisis, this is deeply related. From there, we will talk about how we might harness the potential energy of all the crises we are facing to create transformative change through something I call market story coherence, before discussing 3 fundamental shifts in thinking that will be required to attain it. This is where we'll unpack what a strategic narrative is and how to use it. Finally, I'll end by demonstrating how these shifts in thinking were used in a ClimateTech project as well as others. As I said before, this is going to be a bit of a journey. Over the past 5 or so years, I've gone from a very dark existential place to today being radically optimistic, because I am increasingly driven by the belief that every single one of us has the power to change the world. Just like Tolstoy did when he wrote, "The kingdom of God is within you," which was a major influence on Mahatma Gandhi, who then inspired Martin Luther King. When I first discovered this connection, I was amazed at the power of story. And yeah, story is a huge part of it, but I'd be ridiculous to say that it's the only thing, or even the biggest thing. There's something else at play here. And if we are going to do our part and change this world, whether we are CEOs, entrepreneurs, social visionaries, community leaders, fathers, mothers, or any other leader, we need to figure out what it is and how it fits with everything else. Which is an inquiry that really accelerated for me back towards the end of 2021 when my business was about to go under. I just lost my only 2 clients, my savings were running low, and I was beginning to think this whole strategic narrative dream was going to fail. I had just 1 prospect in the pipeline, 1 late-stage opportunity, and so with my back against the wall, I finished the strategic narrative deck I'd been struggling for months to create and use it to pitch. To my great relief and amazement, it worked better than I could have hoped. I won that engagement, the first in what would add up to 6 figures of work. And then after coming way too close to bankruptcy, landed my first head of marketing role at an ed tech startup. They even gave me a fancy VP title. So, power story. But to be 100% honest with you, something about that story never felt right. Well, yes, virtually every person I presented it to was amazed, and it did bring me some big wins. A strategic narrative is supposed to guide your messaging everywhere. You should, for instance, be able to talk about the crisis, the second act of any strategic narrative, as a powerful thought leadership pillar to build an audience on LinkedIn. The crisis I talked about was how, since the advent of the internet, social media, and smartphones, each of us now has the power to impact millions of people. This power was supposed to bring us together and usher in a golden age of human-to-human connection. But ironically, it's done just the opposite. Because when you put this power into the hands of 8 billion people, what you get is a lot of noise. There is so much signal, so much distraction, and so many voices clamoring for our attention that it can be virtually impossible to get through to people, let alone motivate them to act. Which is a big problem if you're in business, because your product could be literal gold, but if your prospects, your investors, your potential employees don't have a story in their heads about why they should care, you might as well be selling rocks. Unless, of course, they are pet rocks. But when I sat down with this story and tried to promote myself on LinkedIn, I could never bring myself to do it. At first, I thought I was just too chicken to put myself out there. But with time and distance, I came to realize that I just didn't believe in it. Not that it isn't true, it certainly is. Virtually everyone I pitched it to nodded their heads when I made that statement about noise and echoed it in their comments afterwards. Because we can all agree there is a lot of noise out there, so the story definitely has truth. But in the years since creating it, I've come to realize that I just didn't really understand it. Because what exactly are we talking about when we say noise? Like, what does that even mean? Are we talking about the 46 notifications we receive every day, or how mobile applications have been behaviorally designed to not only keep us scrolling for hours, but to modify what we believe and how we act? Are we talking about the ever more noxious culture wars and polarization that are ripping up our sense of community and making good faith dialogue seem impossible? Or are we talking about the sensational headlines and toxic content rabbit holes spewing one calamitous announcement after another about climate change, global pandemics, resource depletion, species extinction, exponential tech, AI risk, rising inequality, declining mental health, institutional decay, social disunity, war, or any of these other complex, deeply intertwined existential risks? Since it never occurred to me to delete social media apps and reconfigure my phone to not grab my attention every damn minute, I soon found myself asking, why is the world like this? I spent years wrestling with this question. I did some deep discovery. I studied the experts. I immersed myself in those wicked problems, following my heart down some very scary rabbit holes, and more than once needed a nice little Netflix binge to distract myself from what I was learning. But just when I'd be starting to concern myself with things like whether Ross from Friends did predict an episode of Black Mirror, something would always pull me back in, like this fan theory that says Game of Thrones is an allegory for climate change, with us humans fighting and competing as an existential catastrophe approaches. This went on for years, basically from when I was in college through my 20s, before really starting to take off a few years ago when I started making some big changes in my life that allowed me to stop binging Netflix and start looking at these problems with clarity. What I was finally able to understand with clarity is that humanity is incoherent. It has become harder than ever to reach shared understanding about what is happening, what it means, and what to do about it. That's sense-making, meaning-making, and choice-making. Technology has undermined our capacity to think. It shortened our attention spans, conditioned us with compulsive behaviors, and replaced our inborn navigational abilities with applications that do our thinking for us. The business models behind this tech incentivize these along with other problematic dynamics. Search engines gave us information overload and confirmation bias. Then social media gave us tribalism and conspiracy theories. Now we have AI-generated deepfakes. In this environment, how can we possibly make sense of what is and what isn't real? Many people just default to what they want to believe. And the algorithms reinforce that by incentivizing them to either say stuff their tribe or in-group already agrees with, or to attack the other tribe or outgroup, which results in what's called a filter bubble effect, where you are increasingly confirmed in your beliefs, while society at large gets more and more polarized. And this, within a culture of radical individualism, has severely diminished our capacity to empathize and understand each other's perspectives, which of course is a huge problem when you're trying to create change in an extremely complex system where you've got many different stakeholders with oftentimes competing perspectives who seem to subconsciously or even consciously act as if they're playing some zero-sum Game of Thrones, where if they don't beat all the other players, they die. This is called a multipolar trap. I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole today of explaining why this is both a principal cause of the climate crisis, as well as why we're having so much trouble mounting a coherent response. But I'll just say that Game of Thrones is a race to the bottom. Everyone loses in the end. But my main point is that our capacity to create strategically coherent action among diverse stakeholders has become severely diminished. And if we don't find a way to navigate this, then we're going to keep getting blindsided when perverse incentives obstruct progress and create systemic failures in our solutions. And then we're just going to end up like the 90+% of startups that failed. 38% of these guys ran out of cash because they failed to articulate a coherent strategy to deliver those returns VCs need. 35% said there was no market need, which essentially means their strategies were incoherent with what their customers actually needed. 20% said they got outcompeted. 19% said flawed business model. And then you got regulatory or legal challenges, pricing and cost issues, not the right team, mistimed products, disharmony between team and investors. Got a little too excited here. All of these stem from a failure to create coherence with the complex realities of a startup's market. And so when I said noise in my first deck, I guess all that is what I was driving at. That is the crisis of coherence. It is harder than ever to inspire strategically coherent action from diverse stakeholders in our markets, which creates existential risk for our startups. This is a problem that must be addressed across every level of society, from collective to individual. Otherwise, we will not mount a coherent response to the climate crisis. Story's a little dramatic, huh?
Nobody gets better.
Anyone ever been on r/collapse? Yeah. If you're just trying to have a nice day, there are some corners of the internet that can be a little complicated to go to. So cool. So coming to a deeper understanding about this stuff was actually a huge relief for me, especially as I found people who could actually make sense of this maddening world we live in. And I think this quote from Charles Kettering captures why. And we haven't completely defined the crisis of coherence. There's a lot more to unpack, but this at least gives us a more clear sense of what we're up against. So now we can go into the solutions. We can flip the emotional polarity towards the positive by asking, how might we bring our strategies and cultures into coherence with both our markets and the planet? And if I can go further, how might we harness the potential energy of all the crises we face to create transformative change at scale? Because if you look at every single transformative movement throughout history, all of them were ignited amidst a deep sense of dissatisfaction or tension. People weren't happy, people were in crisis. Initial conditions had the collective primed like a powder keg. And then somehow, a story emerged that made coherence from those initial conditions, which united everyone behind a shared understanding and galvanized them towards change. We saw this with Wall Street bets, where a bunch of self-described gorillas and crayon eaters collectively caused $5 billion in losses to hedge funds they felt were rigging the game. What's going on with this thing?
Why don't you turn it off?
Yeah, we can try that. Oh, don't worry about it. We'll try to go without it for now. Another example You guys can hear me okay? Cool. Another example is how back in the early 2000s in Colombia, a mother separated from her child by FARC ignited a spontaneous social movement that ended a 50-year civil war. And these spontaneous digital movements share a lot in common with Gandhi's Satyagraha movements in his Quit India speech, as well as MLK's civil rights movement and I Have a Dream. These same parallels exist with Apple and Steve Jobs in Think Different, as well as Salesforce and Marc Benioff in The End of Software. And then HubSpot and Brian Halligan in Inbound Marketing. I remember this one making a total fanboy out of me when I was a young marketer, which is not all that dissimilar from what Elon Musk accomplished with Tesla in the Powerwall pitch. We'll take a closer look at that one a little later. What all of these movements show us is that when there's a crisis and there's all this pent-up negative emotion, the sudden emergence of a coherent story can ignite transformative systemic change. In facing the crises we are facing, with all the rabbit holes and doom scrolling and diseases of despair, we climate entrepreneurs have an opportunity to do this. In each of our corners, each of our markets, we can ignite transformative change at scale by achieving something I call market story coherence. Because product market fit is not enough. This isn't Field of Dreams where customers will magically show up for the product we build. And even if they did magically show up, they're not going to stay for very long if our business model is flawed, if we're burning all our cash trying to grow on the wrong channels, or if we're simply playing in the wrong market. This is why Brian Balfour, a very respected expert on growth, says that in addition to market product fit, which he flipped to put the needs of the market before the product, we also need product channel fit, channel model fit, and model market fit. And that doesn't even account for the fact that we need talent to fill our recruiting pipelines. We need employees to feel valued and inspired. We need investors to feel excited by our vision. We need strategic partners to see a win-win, and a whole bunch of other things. The mind bender here is that none of these can be thought of in silos. They are all networked, interdependent, and constantly breaking at different levels of scale. And so if we are going to achieve that market story coherence, where we tell one story that creates coherence among all these elements in our market, then we need to change the way we operate as leaders. We need to give ourselves permission to be story seers. That means we must immerse ourselves in the complexity in order to study it, sit with it, sense into it until we see the coherence. And then we need to embody that coherence by bringing every cell in our body into alignment behind one story, which we will then allow to flow from ourselves to the others, and then from the others to everyone else, watching as it myceliates out into the market, sprouting new storytellers that each sprout new storytellers that form networks within networks of people who believe what you believe. What I'm talking about here is a synthesis between storytelling, leadership, psychology, neuroscience, systems thinking, and good old-fashioned Silicon Valley wisdom, all to go with the unique gifts and skill sets you already possess. And I believe attaining this can be a game changer because transformative change happens fast and it happens deep. As Nobel laureate Ilya Prigogine said, when a system is far from equilibrium, small islands of coherence in a sea of chaos have the capacity to lift the entire system to a higher order. And so let's be those islands of coherence. And then let's network together in coherence. Because if we can do that, then I believe we will mount a coherent response to the crises we face. All right, let's pause for a quick recap. So we've learned that the crisis of coherence, which is the confluence of our collective and individual failures to build shared understanding, is an existential threat to our startups. We've also learned that there's an opportunity to ignite rapid transformative change at scale by achieving something I call market story coherence. Next, we'll talk about how to achieve it, but first, let's unpack what exactly we mean when we say market story coherence. Here's how I define it. Market story coherence is when the story you're telling, your strategic narrative, galvanizes every single stakeholder in your market behind one mission. To do this, we have to align everyone's incentives, whether they're financial, social, or emotional, behind one systemic transformation, one North Star that's desirable for everyone. For example, Tesla's mission was for humanity to use that giant fusion reactor in the sky. MLK told the American people that now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Whatever your mission, the important thing is that it aligns every stakeholder in taking strategically coherent action. So now let's talk about how to get that. Let's talk about how to embody your strategic narrative. Follow your heart, trust your gut, use the force. We've all heard this common wisdom. When we are faced with critical decisions at any given moment, we lean on our intuition to guide us. It's how jazz bands improvise. It's how legendary sports teams move in sync. It's how leaders quickly make extremely complex decisions. Because their head brains, their heart brains, and their gut brains are all in alignment. Those are the three cognitive processing centers neuroscience now recognizes. When these are aligned, you're in flow. You can make the right decision, say the right thing, inspire the right person, fully present in the moment. And that's what I mean when I say to embody your story. It's like every time you're telling the story, you're in a flow state, start to finish. Because this makes you speak passionately, authentically, coherently at the drop of a hat. And it helps your stakeholders embody the story, which they can then pass to others. For that to happen, we first need to get the story straight within ourselves. Here's a simple framework to do that. Act 1, the setup. Plug into your stakeholders' consciousness by elaborating a dynamic they immediately recognize as true and consequential. This is called sense making. Act 2, the crisis. Impel a sense of urgency by bringing your stakeholders to a point of no return where they must take action now or suffer unacceptable consequences. Act 3, the mission. Inspire your stakeholders to overcome the crisis by aligning them behind a strategically coherent transformation or North Star. Act 4, the implementation. Empower your stakeholders with products, services, values, or directions that help them accomplish the mission. Act 5, the vision. Prove to your stakeholders that the mission is within reach before bringing inspiration to a crescendo with a vision or call to action. Now, every story is different. Not all follow this exactly, but this is the general structure. Let's look at MLK's I Have a Dream. Setup. Abraham Lincoln promised us equality. Crisis. Where the hell is it? Mission. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Implementation. Don't mistrust all white people. Don't stop until we get what we want. Vision. I have a dream. Let's take a look at Tesla next. Setup. Climate change is real. Wink, wink. Crisis. Bad chart at inflection point. Mission. Let's use the sun. Implementation. Tesla Powerwall. Vision. Musk shows the Powerwall powering the presentation. And then he closes the loop, this is the vision part, by showing how all of these products help us avert that CO2 inflection point. Now here's how I think about it. You can think of this sort of as a meta-strategic narrative that demonstrates the structure. Once upon a time, there was a market. That market consisted of many different stakeholders, each of whom had different perspectives and cared about different things. One day, there came a massive crisis that affected every stakeholder. Some understood it, some didn't, but all were affected in some way. In order to overcome the crisis, every stakeholder needed to unite behind one common mission that would help everyone. Each stakeholder was then empowered to do what was uniquely theirs to do towards the mission. Stakeholder after stakeholder found success, inspiring others to join the mission, which propelled each of them towards a brighter future together. 5 acts to hyperscale, I used to say. 5 Shakespearean acts. But honestly, you could use the hero's journey. You could use Aristotle's 3-act structure, or Blake Snyder's Save the Cat, or Robert McKee's story, or Andy Raskin's strategic narrative. All of these structures are just different models approximating the same structure that underlies human consciousness. Because story is a cognitive structure. That means it happens 100% inside of us. All we're doing when we're telling a story is we are ordering the sound waves that are coming out of our mouths and the light waves from whatever we're showing in such a way that it's easy for our stakeholders' brains to reassemble them into a coherent story. And if you guys are familiar with an OODA loop, which is a framework to describe how humans make decisions, a 5-act structure is basically the same thing. We're just adding that 5th act for when your brain releases all that dopamine as a reward for succeeding. So use whatever model works for you. I'm not dogmatic. 5-act Shakespearean works best for me. Now, just because we're masters of 5-act storytelling doesn't mean that we can unite a market. To do that, we need to ask ourselves, how might we unite stakeholders behind the same crisis and mission when they are so different? Like, my customers understand my product, but my investors don't. Or maybe other stakeholders in my market see the value, but the customers, the ones that have the money, don't. I've seen this a whole bunch from companies trying to get corporations to fund a social or environmental good. And so we can ask a parallel question. How might we connect the dots such that everyone understands themselves to be characters in our story? We need them to feel convincingly how the crisis affects them and how joining the mission would serve them. And in order to make that happen, we need to change the way we look at reality. And collectively, as a species, we already are, because we've seen a massive paradigm shift in the sciences over the past century. With the advent of quantum physics, we no longer understand the universe to be this vast, mostly empty space where separate parts occasionally bump into each other. But rather, we understand it as one unified whole, one unified system composed of many deeply interconnected subsystems, which themselves are composed of smaller and smaller subsystems, and so on. We might simply say that everything is connected, or everything is one, which is what some of our greatest scientific minds have said. We have to understand the universe as one whole. Quantum physics reveals a basic oneness of the universe. Einstein said that there is one whole we call universe, and that the idea that we are separate from everything else is an optical delusion of consciousness. Which is kind of crazy if you think about it. I remember the auto-suggest on my phone kept trying to bring up quotes from Lao Tzu and Buddha when I was writing this. And it's what our indigenous friends around the world say too. Indigenous Africans have the concept of Ubuntu, for instance, which essentially says that we on planet Earth are all connected. What we do to one, we do to the whole, we do to ourselves. And in order for us in the modern world to understand this, we have a discipline called systems thinking. It emerged in recent years to help us in fields like engineering and ecology, but is now helping us unravel the wicked problems of what some are calling the polycrisis, which is an emergent property of what others are calling the metacrisis. And so if we try to fix nature like we would fix a machine, that is, if we treat a complex system as if it were complicated, we will run into problems. And even if we succeed on one metric, we will create a ripple effect of unintended consequences throughout that system, as well as all the others it's connected to. One example might be what happened with the carbon markets recently. Or another example closer to home for me. If we tell a super powerful $1.3 trillion market cap AI to optimize everyone's social news feeds for time on site and engagement, yeah, we make a lot of money. But what we don't factor into that equation is that things like outrage, tribalism, doom scrolling, and body dysmorphia are really good at driving engagement. So the algorithm effectively optimizes for those things, and we end up with unintended consequences. There's lots of examples in B2B too. If we silo our revenue team based on funnel stage, where marketing generates leads, sales closes them, and customer success does renewals without understanding how all of these things are interconnected, then we end up doing marketing tactics that generate lots of shitty leads without buying intent. Our sales team gets desperate and has to close bad fit customers, and then our customer success team struggles with renewal. Anyone who's been in those company all hands where you miss another revenue target knows that it kind of sucks. People get worried, tensions bubble up, someone's feelings get hurt, bad Glassdoor reviews appear, and now you're having trouble finding good sales or marketing people. Vicious cycle. Again, everything is connected. The better we understand that, the better we can identify the crisis that affects our stakeholders and then articulate the mission that'll unite them. Sticking with the previous example, if we were HubSpot, for instance, we would see that crisis, we'll call it crisis of funnel to be cheeky, as an opportunity to expand beyond inbound marketing. So we come up with a story that uses the crisis of funnel to show that the funnel is broken. Then we'd unite our stakeholders behind the mission of achieving the unified customer flywheel. This then helps us sell HubSpot sales, HubSpot service, CRM, etc. So we evolve our narrative to get new business lines, a bigger TAM, juicier valuation, good stuff. If we story seers learn to see coherence in complexity, then we can do this too. We have to understand the crisis and then find the leverage point, which we talk about in our mission, that'll tip the entire system towards transformation. This understanding is what we embody with a strategic narrative. And once we do that, we get to the fun part where we just let it flow out of us. I remember how surprised I was comparing the before and after footage for my first client. Before the story, his prospects would be bored, distracted, confused when he pitched. Lots of questions, lots of disengagement in the end. Afterwards, none of that. Rapt attention for the whole pitch. And you could actually feel the coherence in the prospect. Full attention, full engagement, lots of head nods, no looking at the cell phone, no confusion in the end. It was either a hell yeah or a thanks, but not for me. He quickly scaled to almost 5 million ARR shortly after that. A coherent strategic narrative lets us create a similar effect everywhere. What I always do is write a speech, which my clients and I turn into a sales deck. This acts as a vehicle for the narrative. You get to take it to the market and test it out quickly, but you can also present it to employees at all hands to get them inspired, or to job candidates to onboard them to the mission. Then you can use it as a document to guide your messaging everywhere. Website, explainer video, content, investor pitch deck. Now, this one is a hard adaptation because your investors have such a different perspective than your customers. I know this is a common challenge with this crowd, so I'll spend a little bit of time here. A key thing to understand about stories is they are fractals. Every story is composed of little stories. Scenes, chapters, acts, those are all just little stories. And every story, every whole story is just a scene, chapter, or act inside a bigger story. Now, I haven't done any investor pitches myself yet, but here's how I think about them. VCs need those 10x returns. 100 million plus valuations, unicorn rocket ships is part of their business model. And depending on where your company is at today, the crisis, mission, and vision that inspires your customers might not be big enough to inspire a VC. So you got to go bigger. You have to recontextualize the mission, crisis, and vision you're using today as story beats inside a grander story arc taking place over a longer time horizon, where investing in your bigger mission to solve a bigger crisis will return their entire fund. To do that, you must first make that story believable by quickly articulating investment theses based on dynamics the VC can immediately recognize as truth. This is sense making. Again, it's the goal of that first act. For example, I love what Reid Hoffman did with the LinkedIn Series B deck. Very early on, he frames the narrative by talking about the shift from Internet 1.0 to Internet 2.0. And then he shows successful examples. So he names a very real dynamic, a shift that potential investors immediately feel in their bodies as undeniably true. That's important, which then creates a sense of inevitability, which he frames LinkedIn as a part of that shift, which creates a fear of missing out or a FOMO. Everything after that is just making the FOMO bigger and de-risking. Now, I've never been a VC, but other than losing millions on a crash and burn startup that got your hopes up, I'd imagine there's nothing worse than watching those early stage shares you could have had at a discount hit a unicorn IPO and make someone else very rich. Tough job. 90+% of startups fail, and they got to somehow find the diamond in the rough. Otherwise, they burn millions. Sounds like a lot of stress to me. So let's help them out. Let's engage those heart and gut brains. That head brain tends to worry and second guess itself when we leave it to make decisions alone. Help them see and embody the coherence, and then build up the opportunity, and then de-risk, de-risk, de-risk. Now, adapting your narrative to a different customer segment or persona is a lot easier. Different stakeholders, same mission, same crisis, different flavors, same candy. You can also use the third act of your story, the mission, to help you pick a North Star metric. This is how a story seer might think of their company, like a multi-stakeholder funnel aligned behind that one mission. All right, quick recap. We can overcome the crisis of coherence by achieving market story coherence, which is the degree to which your story galvanizes every actor in your market behind one mission. In order to do that, we combine systems thinking with a 5-act structure to articulate how a crisis affects every stakeholder in your market and why joining your mission helps. Then we let it flow across sales, marketing, fundraising, recruiting, product, everywhere. Now let's get a taste of this thinking in action by taking a quick look at a few of my clients before I leave us with some closing remarks. When I started working with Drea Burbank and Savimbo, they were about a year into a pivot. They'd moved from carbon to biodiversity credits generated by tracking totemic species, indicator species the indigenous peoples of the Colombian Amazon use to measure the health of their ecosystem. In this case, jaguars. Now, everyone seemed interested, but no one was buying. Apparently, some corporate CSRs told her to shove off, and that they'd never buy biodiversity credits, which was understandable because some corporations got burned pretty bad by the whole carbon market debacle when a Guardian article showed that 47 out of 50 projects studied were junk. All the companies that bought the credits got accused of greenwashing. So companies were pretty traumatized, and no one wanted to take a risk on unproven biodiversity credits from an indigenous paradigm they didn't understand. So we got to work on their positioning. We used a systems thinking concept called collective intelligence, representing a public corporation as the Canaanite god Moloch, to gain a clear understanding of their prospects' motivations. We decided to position Savimbo away from compliance. That's one of 3 things you can sell B2B, towards growth. Because Moloch hates spending money complying with government regulations, and he loves top-line revenue growth. It's sexy. So we fed this into a story, which is now informing Drea's messaging in her pitches. She just told me the other day that since working together, they've gone from a trickle of sales from friends and family to now almost completely selling out their inventory. She attributes all the success they're now having on the enterprise side to the work we did together. The next example, Lab for You, has some similarities. They're a Chilean edtech selling a K-12 STEM learning solution into enterprise CSR departments. They had a couple big wins, but sales, marketing, and fundraising were a struggle, and there was a lot of confusion among the team. You had former educators, you had commercial engineers, you had technologists, and you had a lot of Frankenstein decks. So to make order from this chaos, we got to work using systems thinking. We had to articulate why Moloch would want to spend his quarterly budget instilling a love for science in K-12 students. Then we had to connect a bunch of dots to show compellingly to corporate execs, CFOs, etc., why this was an existentially urgent issue for their company. To do that, we used a tool called ecosystem maps. We informed this using CRM data, a bunch of customer discovery, through which we surfaced some very powerful insights and ultimately realized that our setup in crisis would need to quickly connect the dots between education, poverty, climate change, AI automation, talent gaps, and corporate financial performance without in any way making the executive feel like we were in an NGO asking for a donation. Because that's the difference between $10,000 and $100,000. Ecosystem maps were crucial at every stage of this journey. So more to come on Lab for You as we roll out their deck. But since pivoting to climate and regeneration a little over a year ago, I've been blessed to work on many other inspiring projects. Helping Conconco win UNDP funding has probably been my favorite so far. And it's been an absolute blessing for me because I've gotten to learn, I've gotten to connect, and I've gotten to feel the open-eyed optimism, hope, and belief that despite all the challenges we face, maybe the best is yet to come. And so I'd like to close now by reflecting on butterflies. When the caterpillar goes into the cocoon, it begins the process of metamorphosis, wherein it consumes calories exponentially, unsustainably, until eventually it completes its transformation and then bursts out of the cocoon, reborn. Given everything that we're seeing all around the Anthropocene, I have to wonder if maybe our human civilization is going through the same thing. There are these cells inside the caterpillar called imaginal cells. They're like visionaries. And in order for the metamorphosis to succeed, they must stop acting as individuals and come together to form clusters, coherence. And from this, the butterfly is born. Those imaginal cells have to come together just like we have to come together now, because there is no one hero coming to save us. These times do not call for one MLK or Gandhi to appear and save the day. We need millions, not one Messiah, millions of Messiahs, networked together in coherence. This is why we must be the change. Or, if I may be so bold, be the coherence. Because every single one of us has this power. We are human, we are story seer, and together we will do this. and maybe we'll hit that unicorn rocket ship while we're at it. Thank you. Hope you guys enjoyed the story. We'll open it up for some questions.